The Switch. The Switch is a podcast about ideas and experiences that change our minds. In this episode, we speak with Mike Murphy. Mike Murphy is a distinguished teaching professor emeritus in the Department of Natural Sciences at State University of New York, Cobleskill. He's got a bunch of biology degrees, including both a master's and a PhD. He has taught courses in ethics and science, medicine and technology, developmental biology, vertebrate anatomy, histology, parasitology, endocrinology, general biology, microbiology, biotechnology, physiology, ethics in science, and pharmaceuticals. He has a bunch of work in bioethics, including work at Chinese universities. Look, I'm not going to read his whole CV right now because it's impressive. You just need to hear this guy talk.
If you like what we do here on The Switch, the best way to support us is through Patreon. You can find us at www.patreon.com/switch_podcast. You can also check us out on social media. On Instagram and Twitter, we are at switch_podcast, and on Facebook, we are The Switch Podcast. The Switch is produced by Mojo Filter Media, a company specializing in audio production for video games and interactive media. You can check out our website at www.mojofilter.media.
And so, without further delay, we start with a quote from Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. Decades of psychological research suggest that unconscious processes influence belief formation, and not all of them assist us in our search for truth. When asked to judge the probability that an event will occur, or the likelihood that one event caused another, people are frequently misled by a variety of factors, including the unconscious influence of extraneous information. For instance, if asked to recall the last 4 digits of their social security numbers and then asked to estimate the number of doctors practicing in San Francisco, the resulting numbers will show a statistically significant relationship. Needless to say, when the order of questions is reversed, this effect disappears. There have been a few efforts to put a brave face on such departures from rationality, construing them as random performance errors, or as a sign that experimental subjects have misunderstood the tasks presented to them, or even as proof that research psychologists themselves have been beguiled by false norms of reasoning. But efforts to exonerate our mental limitations have generally failed. There are some things that we are just naturally bad at, and the mistakes people tend to make across a wide range of reasoning tasks are not mere errors. They're systematic errors that are strongly associated both within and across tasks. As one might expect, many of these errors decrease as cognitive ability increases. We also know that training, using both examples and formal rules, mitigates many of these problems and can improve a person's thinking. Reasoning errors aside, we know that people often acquire their beliefs about the world for reasons that are more emotional and social than strictly cognitive. Wishful thinking, self-serving bias, in-group loyalties, and frank self-deception can lead to monstrous departures from the norms of rationality. Most beliefs are evaluated against a background of other beliefs, and often in the context of an ideology that a person shares with others. Consequently, people are rarely as open to revising their views as reason would seem to dictate. And here with us today to talk about intuition in a variety of related fields, we have Mike Murphy. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here.
Mike, before we get into our formal topic here, I just want to get a little background on you and where you came from. So why don't we just start with, where did you grow up and sort of who and what were your influences in your formative years?
Sure. Most of my childhood was spent in Castleton-on-Hudson. I come from a very, very large family. I have 10 siblings. My parents were working class people. My dad is since deceased. Interestingly, my mom is a nun. So it makes an interesting dynamic with me as an atheist and my mom a nun. It's a wonderful background to have discussions. And I essentially consciously decided to do well in school, actually to escape my family. And that actually worked out quite well academically. So I was quite interested actually when I went to Siena College in languages. I started out as a French major and then took a biology course. again, rationally thought I could make a living doing biology a little bit better than doing French. So I switched into biology, but took a lot of philosophy along the way as well. And so I was a researcher and an academician, and really was interested in particular in the field of biotechnology. I developed the biotechnology baccalaureate program at Cobleskill. And as we were developing it, I began reading articles about ethical problems and conundrums in biotechnology. So I decided to continue my philosophy training and went out to University of Illinois on an NSF-sponsored program, and completed that, and then developed the ethics curriculum at the college. And that's still going, and I still teach in that area, primarily in China. But that program has been taken now to, I think, 4 or 6 countries, primarily by Linda McMaster Schuyler. So I've always been interested in these areas. And in my avocation, I do music, primarily medieval and Renaissance winds. So that's essentially my background.
All right. Where do you think the interest in biology stemmed from?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I have to say, probably my first biology teacher in high school really showed us some really wonderful examples of the natural world. But when I hit Siena College, I had a fabulous mentor, Dr. Patricia Brown, and then later her husband, Steve Brown. And she became a second parent for me, and consequently he did as well. And they really took me under their wings and hired me every summer to do research. And so I found it fascinating, and I have been on that path ever since. I still do a lot of online research rather than laboratory research. But really it was mentoring. Mentoring is the big aspect. I still like languages. Before I went to China, I took 2 semesters of Mandarin. My French is much better than my Mandarin, and my Czech is better than my Mandarin as well. But the borders between disciplines are really quite artificial.
So you mentioned sort of getting into bioethics, having taken the philosophy courses and sort of melding biology with philosophy. So for those who may not know, what exactly is bioethics?
Well, ethics in general, and then I'll relate it to biology, is
Sure.
Doing the right thing for the right reasons. And that's essentially it in a nutshell, although I think that if you read moral philosophy texts, you might have some more diffuse examples of definitions. But in the biological sciences, as with all sciences, there is potential for abuse, for example. If you take the example of bioweapons, that's a very clear example of weapons of mass destruction. If you take the example of gene editing today, primarily through, there's a new technique called CRISPR-Cas. So the potential to change or edit any gene in not only humans, but in all organisms is very great and very immediate right now. So the question is, not only can we do a technique, but should we do a technique? What are the consequences? What's the motivation behind doing them? And then what harm does it cause, and what good does it hopefully cause as well?
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings us into what we wanted to talk about today, which is kind of the best way to figure that stuff out. And it may not necessarily be through our intuitions. And first off, I just want to define intuition. And I wrote down the ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning, or a thing that one knows or considers likely from instinctive feeling rather than conscious reasoning.
So those, I think, are interesting definitions. I would quibble with the word understanding. I think that my preference would be intuition is a non-analytical mental process that allows us to arrive at an idea and possibly even a conclusion or a hypothesis without being consciously aware of the mental processing that's involved. And the understanding in this case then can either be entirely accurate or it can be grossly faulty. But as a mental process, and we as animals, like all animals, evolved physiological and neurological processes for two main reasons. One is for survival, and the other is for reproduction. So whether we use an analytical method, which is largely restricted to us and perhaps the higher primates and perhaps the cetaceans, um, all organisms in some fashion will arrive at some behavior in response to stimuli. Now, for animals per se, particularly I'm talking about those with not so what we would call high cognitive function, the process of self-awareness is quite limited, and consequently, the analytical processes are quite limited as well. For us, we're relatively unique in the sense that we have access to, through training and through education, an analytical process that allows us to not only examine a conclusion or an idea that we might have formulated, but also the processes involved in those ideas. So if you contrast it with animal instinct, we have instinct, we're animals as well. So an instinct in a human would be the startle reaction. So if someone comes into the room and you don't see them and they are there, and particularly if there's a loud noise, we get startled. And the typical primate behavior you would see is we yell and step back and the eyes dilate. So that's quite a different response. That's an immediate response. Intuition, I've heard it described as being like a candle in a darkened room. It's sort of this feeling you might have about an idea. Someone might refer to it as a gut feeling or a feeling from the heart. And but it's still based on experience. And so evolutionarily, it's still designed to protect us. It's designed to make sure that we're safe and designed to help us with our reproductive capacity. This is my view, by the way.
Yeah. I think I have a similar view. I was earlier, Alex and I were talking about this topic of intuition versus something like memorized knowledge. And this is in the context of learning. So one of the things that I was saying was when I learn new things, my process tends to be aimed toward incorporating whatever I'm learning into my intuition, like retraining my intuition so that whatever it is I'm learning is now, it just makes sense to me and I can feel my way through it. For the example would be like computer programming. When I'm programming a game or something, I'm not, remembering code snippets or recalling specific like documentation that I've read or memorized. I'm sort of feeling my way through what I've thought out the process to be. I'm sort of feeling my way through the way it should work, almost the same way that I would form a sentence, right? I'm not remembering definitions of words. I'm sort of intuiting my way through, like, this is the thought I'm having, and the words just sort of come to me. What do you think of that view of intuition?
Right. Well, I think that we have to be careful, Chase, of a couple of things that are happening in the brain, as far as I understand brain processing and brain functioning. The brain is still actually doing the processing that we are calling intuition. It's just that you actually described an experience of giving yourself more neural pathways or repeating the same kind of neural pathways to make your intuition, from what I understand, more accurate in coming to, the goal that you want. The fact that you don't have to think about it anymore is quite similar to how a musician, particularly, if you think about a wonderful keyboardist, has been practicing, and she or he now doesn't need to use the music at all. And actually, there's no conscious way that they're thinking about every finger moving, to do the grand piece. But it was the practice that made the accuracy of what she or he is doing that much better. And so the danger, I think, in our discussion today is there are individuals who, for one reason or another, it may be intellectual laziness, it may be simply with no opportunity, they've either elected or did not have an opportunity to have that training to know that you actually can make or cause intuition to be more accurate the more you use it. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Just to continue on the line of thinking, I guess my example of a different kind of knowledge would be something like the Monty Hall problem. Are you familiar with the Monty Hall problem?
Yes, I am. Right.
Actually, do you want to explain it?
Well, this is my understanding of it, and you all can correct me since you brought it up. So, the Monty Hall problem, it's a standard setup as if there's a game show and there are 3 doors and you can get something valuable behind one door. A car is typically used as an example. And behind the other 2 doors, there's something you don't want. And the classic example are goats. Now, why someone wouldn't want a goat is beyond me, but nevertheless, they want the car, the more valuable thing. Now, the assumption in the Monty Hall example is that the host actually knows what's behind at least one of the doors. So the host then makes a non-random choice, and that's critical. So the non-random choice that the host makes is they open up door number 1. The car actually is behind one of the other doors. And you've already made your decision, by the way, on whatever door you're choosing, perhaps door number 3. And the host then shows you the goat. You don't want the goat. You're goatophobic. And gives you an opportunity to change your mind. You can now switch whatever remaining door that you want. Our intuition would tell us then you still have a 50-50 chance of choosing a car. But in fact, the mathematics and the theory of probability tells us, in fact, you have a greater chance if you switch rather than keeping with the original door. And this is how that works. If the host said to you at the beginning, instead of opening a door, you can either choose one door or you can choose any 2 doors. That's essentially the choice you have. But regardless of whether the host opens the door or not, he's still giving you the choice between 1 door and 2 doors. And so not only mathematically can you demonstrate that it's better to switch, by the way, but in terms of real life experiments, this experiment has been done. And in fact, 30% of the time, if you stay with the original door, you might get the car. That's still, by the way, a fairly good opportunity, but not great. But 2/3 of the time, or better, switching will get you the car if that's your goal. So intuitively, and by the way, this is very controversial because even philosophers and mathematicians quibbled about this for quite a long time.
Yeah, that was a beautiful explanation. Thank you. So the reason that I brought that up is because that's a case where I know the conclusion and I've sort of memorized the answer, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right.
But I have not been able to retrain my intuition to make that the answer that should be there. So that was the contrast I was making between retraining intuition and just memorizing.
Well, that's actually a hard one because when the original example is presented, the assumptions actually make a difference. And the assumption that the host actually knows which door, it's not a random choice. And it's the randomness. If the host honestly didn't know and chose a door, that would be a different experiment altogether.
Yeah.
That one is hard to retrain because your decision is still choosing between door number 3 or door number 2. That's still your choice. And so your experience with both mathematics and with probability says it's still 50-50, right?
Yeah.
But in fact, it's a false assumption because the host made a non-random choice. And really he's saying, do you want to choose 1 door or do you want to choose 2 doors?
So one of the questions I've been looking forward to asking you is, are there examples of this sort of counterintuitive nature of things in biology?
Well, I would say probably not as concrete as this, but I would say all animals are going to use their experience to try to detect danger to themselves. So if you think, for example, about a primate, then let's take a higher primate, a chimpanzee, who's maybe mature, so has a lot of experience in the forest. And one of the things we know from Jane Goodall's work is that without Jane being able to detect why the animals are acting this way, the animals all of a sudden will become quiet and very, very alert. There's no real detectable clue about what's going on. So it seems like the higher chimps have some kind of intuition. Now, if you combine, and by the way, the subtle cues that are there that we probably don't hear are maybe they don't hear certain variety of insects, or they don't hear birds, or they've heard a rustle or something like this, but it's at a sort of subliminal level. And then the behavior of one chimp cues the behavior of others. Then if you throw that into the mix, the wonderful experiments that have been done with mirrors and living organisms in the wild and living organisms in capture, you can have a chimpanzee in a controlled environment be exposed to a mirror, and the chimpanzee, after some time, will learn that the reflection actually is himself or herself. So chimpanzees have that self-awareness. The reason we know this is because the researchers take the mirror away, and they'll put a pigment on one of their eyebrows, return the mirror to the chimpanzee, and the chimpanzee then doesn't touch the mirror, but touches its own eyebrow. Now, if you do the same thing with the monkey won't do this. It doesn't have the cognitive capability to do this. So those two groups of chimpanzees now are trained differently. One in the wild who's naive to mirrors, and the one that's not naive. If you put a mirror then out in the wild and a chimpanzee comes across it unexpectedly, you get a startle reaction. The intuition is telling the chimpanzee, and of course part of it is instinct as well, that this is not self. There's no possibility of self. It's not in the experience, the background experience. But a chimpanzee who's familiar with mirrors, that's a different story. There might be a subdued startle reaction, but then a curiosity and an almost immediate self-awareness. That's a mirror, that's me. So it's the background, the experience that makes a difference for animals that have greater cognition. Do they get it wrong? Yeah, yes. Well, the one animal who was naive got it wrong.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't the correct response.
Yeah.
It didn't need that response, I should say, for survival.
So what about in things like some of the knowledge that we've gained through our study of biology? Are there areas where human intuition would say something counter to the way that things actually are? Like I'm thinking of actually Alex has a great example if you want to give that. But Mike, feel free to jump in if you have an answer already.
Well, let's hear Alex's example,
Sure.
and we'll see if we can run that one.
Chase, are you talking about the?
Yeah. Your example is not from biology; it's from a different field.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it was astronomy class in 12th grade in high school, we were learning about relativity, and I was presented for the first time that when you have one person on Earth and one person out in space going closer to the speed of light, just faster in general, the time is not match up when they come back. So the example was a clock is in orbit going, faster than the rotation of the Earth, and it comes back and it's slightly off. And that just didn't make sense to me, because how can speed be in any way related to time? Those seem like two totally different things to me. So
right, that's a wonderful example from physics. I'm certainly no expert in physics, and a physicist could answer there, but I'll try. So, in fact, this is why it's called the theory of relativity, because it is relative. Time actually doesn't move any faster from the perspective of each individual. It might move faster from the perspective of one to the other. So it's a relative event. So, of course, our intuition, by the way, Einstein predicted this. But the prediction didn't come only because of his intuition, although Einstein was a great believer in intuition. And then, of course, intuition leading to insight. But his prediction was that relative to the observer, an object in motion that's going faster and faster, the mathematics essentially said time essentially relative to the observer is going to move faster and faster. And even physicists at the time, with all of their experience and all of their mathematics, didn't believe this initially because our intuition, it doesn't make sense. Even most of us today, I mean, it's perfectly understandable to have this confusion around it. It doesn't make logical sense. In the same way, if you look at a very clear example in physics is because it makes intuitive sense when we look at the sky and there's this great flashlight going from dawn to dusk across the sky, our intuition says that the great flashlight, the sun, is actually moving. That's what makes perfect sense to us. And in fact, it's only because of what we've learned now and our experiences with our education and our training that now it still, by the way, when you look at the sun, all of us, we say the sun has moved, from the horizon to noontime. And we all know that's not the case. So we have to take ourselves outside of our bodies and into our mind to really visualize, in fact, what's happening. This is a simple way of saying that a similar thing is happening in our understanding or our assessment of what's happening with the time phenomenon and motion. And that's the best way I can describe it, that if the mathematics demonstrate it to be accurate, and now we actually have atomic clocks that have demonstrated it to be accurate, then that in fact is the real world. And our intuition then is wrong, clearly. Does that help you with your intuition? Probably not. But it helps to know that, in fact, intuition is sometimes wrong. And by the way, intuition is mostly right. Most of the time, it does what it's supposed to do. It saves us from danger. It helps us with reproduction. It's mostly right. But it lets us know that there are times that are significant enough that the wrong that we should say is the gut feeling, is the feeling from the heart, is it wrong? Should we go back and do a conscious analysis rather than letting the subconscious brain decide from the cues that we're getting?
Yeah, and most of the examples we bring up, they're not things that are like paramount to living or dying in that moment. Our brain seems
right, but our brains are wired that way.
Right. Yeah. But I think that makes sense why the examples we bring up are not those things, because like you said, our intuition gets it right on questions more related to that usually.
And that's why we trust intuition.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to trust intuition.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also good if you're in an academic field or even in everyday life. I mean, some of our misconceptions arise because we trusted our intuition too much. And also we have confirmational bias. We select those pieces of information that simply reinforce a worldview.
So do you see sort of the consequences of faulty intuition in fields like bioethics?
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. I particularly see it in medical ethics, although I think in both bioethics and medical ethics, it's actually getting better. Primarily because in almost every institution of higher learning and every hospital and medical college situation now, there are actually training programs in ethics. And these are designed to address when our intuitions can be faulty. So, for example, in medical ethics, it's important to train physicians, not only from the United States, but we have a lot of physicians that come from international locations, about perhaps what a disease might be in someone that comes in looking filthy. They may look like they may smell bad, and they may present, for example, with a condition where they have neurological issues. And our intuition might say immediately, because of our past experiences, that the individual might be suffering from some kind of mental illness, say, for example. In fact, it might be that the individual was bitten by a deer tick and ended up getting Borrelia and actually has Lyme disease. And so the analytical process then is flawed because it wasn't used. Instead, the use first of intuition leads to an assumption of a diagnosis rather than let's test a hypothesis to see if our diagnoses are accurate. In the biological sciences, in the research laboratory, I'll give you a good example in my own field. So I did research in kidney function in birds while they were still in their shells. So it was a really interesting area. My intuition said, and all of our intuition and my colleagues said, the calcium that was acquired for bones came from the shell. I mean, it's a calcified structure. It should come from the shell. So a colleague of mine set out to actually prove this and found out that only about half of the calcium came from the shell at all. So the question is, where did the rest of the calcium come from? And why was our hypothesis wrong? Why didn't it all come from the shell? And in fact, half of it comes from the yolk sac. And if you inject a little bit of vitamin D into the yolk sac, all of a sudden you get this huge spike in calcium in the blood of the animal. So again, our hypothesis testing in the sciences helps us defeat the inaccuracies of intuition, but not completely.
Yeah. And actually, those two examples are really good for illustrating that there are almost two levels that we're talking about here with intuition. There's the one level of you've got things like your survival instincts kicking in, or your sort of evolutionary instinct to survive or reproduce, which would make you maybe judge a neurologically damaged patient from some disease a certain way, versus a more analytical level where you've got this problem presented to you, and the failure in your intuition in trying to figure out where this calcium was coming from wasn't necessarily rooted in your instinct to survive or in your instinct to reproduce. It was more just a perceptual error in the situation. Do you think that's a fairly accurate way to talk about it?
I think it's accurate. I think in terms of a neurological basis for both cognitive processes, however, one being conscious and one maybe not so conscious, I think our brains are really wired to come to conclusions relatively rapidly. They're wired to do that. And so it's hard to slow down that process without conscious effort. And so whether it's because it's survival today or not, the historical evolutionary development of our brain still wired that way. So these very, very quick decisions, very quick conclusions, they had to be made because our ancestors had very, very little time in most circumstances to react. They certainly didn't have the leisure we have today of being able to say, "Oh, am I right or not?" In the meantime, the saber-tooth is chewing at your legs.
So, sort of a related question: why would we not have evolved to see things more accurately? Is it just because we need to make decisions quickly and accuracy is hard?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Jason. I like it quite a bit. So, nature doesn't care about us at all. There's no caring. It's just, you're going to be successful as a species if you reproduce. That's it. So the fact that we ended up with, wonderful analytical minds, or the potential to have use analyses, certainly gave us a leg up. It allowed us to hunt and do agriculture and all those things. So it did give us some advantages. But it's not to say we have to use those skills all the time and to survive, because clearly, you look at the world today, and I would say, vast number of individuals are not using their analytical mind most of the time. I will say I don't use my analytical mind most of the time. When I set my science hat on, or my ethics hat on, or my academic hat on, then I consciously choose to do it, then it's done. But other than that, I sort of let the information flow in, and I listen to music, and those things are not critical to survive.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer, and I guess one of the examples that I came up with earlier, and I don't know if this illustrates anything more specifically than what you had just said, but something like your sense of smell is sort of a basic detector of the chemical makeup of the air, but it's not always very accurate. There are things that are potentially harmful that you can't smell, and there are things that you can smell, but you can't smell very accurately. And so there's this sort of evolutionary force of, on the one hand, being able to detect the chemical makeup of the air, but on the other hand, it's not very precise.
Right. And of course, in humans and higher primates in general, our compensation is our sense of sight. That really compensates for a lot. And frankly, our higher cognition. So I want to give you an example, though, of where the analytical brain actually is much worse than the intuitive brain. And let's go back to the example of music.
Sure. Yeah.
So my mentor, Patricia Brown, was a wonderful, wonderful person. I miss her dearly. She died of breast cancer quite some years ago. But she had some great examples. I don't know if this is one of her own or if she actually was relating this. But she said the analytical brain, if you were listening to a wonderful, great, virtuosic pianist, and they were doing some just spectacular Rachmaninoff, and you wanted to be a reductionist, and you wanted to analyze what made this music so great. She said one of the things you could do is try to figure out the components. Is it because of his or her muscle dexterity? Is it the instrument? So let's see if the great music is because it's the piano. So let's take the piano completely apart with the goal of understanding great music. And, you don't get the correct answer. You just don't. Perhaps it could be reduced to the sum of its parts. But this is where our intuition actually is better in the social sciences sense, currently at least, than the current state of neurobiology and cognitive analytical research.
Do you think that's partly because there's just so much involved with so much that's gone into building our intuition around music and what sounds beautiful and it's a great performance, that there's years and years of input coming into our minds that have formed what we perceive as great music, that just to try to then separate that into these components, it's just both too difficult and not, you can't take all those experiences and analyze all of them. That would take forever.
Right. I think that's absolutely right, Alex. There are things that you can analyze, of course. Certainly it depends on our experience and our culture, our cultural sense. If you look at what is pleasing to the ear of a typical Western listener of music, you might have a very typical chord progression that, it's very pleasant. It's in thirds and fifths, and it's very, very predictable, maybe in a major and minor key, but nevertheless, it's quite predictable. But something that may not be accustomed to our hearing might be, for example, the sounds made on unusual instruments. We might find the sound itself, not necessarily the note or the pitch, but the sound itself grating. Yet in another culture, they might find that because that's their image of beauty or their sense of beauty, that it's quite different. I know when we play in our Renaissance ensemble, if we take out our shawms and are doing loud things on our shawms, we warn people ahead of time, particularly if we're doing it in a nursing home setting, because they're loud and they sound like a raucous buzz. So that you can, if you want to see a startle reaction, do one of those performances and decline from warning the audience.
So this sounds almost like a similar, it's definitely different in the sense of intuition versus analysis, but it sounds like a similar issue, the sort of reductionism as the issue of the sort of departmentalization of various fields of discovery. So, for instance, you can talk about a historical instance. The example, I think this actually came from a podcast with Sam Harris and David Deutsch. The example of a historical event like the assassination of JFK.
Uh-huh.
You can talk about it in terms of physics, right? There is some physics explanation for what happened. You can talk about it in terms of biology. There's a biological explanation for things that have happened. There's a sociological explanation, there's a historical explanation, and all these explanations of this event have their own compartmentalized meaning, but there is no, by just sort of having that myopic view of, this is my department, therefore this is, how I'm going to analyze this problem, it's myopic. There's no sort of universal understanding, and that may not be the best example of that, but
no, I think actually, Chase, it's a good one. And this is where our earlier comments about the borders between disciplines being an artificial construct, they really shouldn't be. This is why I really like the model of being a Renaissance person and dissolving those borders, because the borders don't help inform. They do just the opposite. They keep this informed holistic image and processing from happening. And that's a very, very important thing. In the field of ethics, I would submit that when we do only reasoning to arrive at a conclusion and leave out component of compassion and the role of emotion and compassion in our analysis, then ethicists as well get the answer wrong as well. We arrive at a truth that is not a truth for the human condition. This is why I was quite interested in one of your previous podcasts on Stoicism, and why I think I told you I'm only an episodic Stoic.
Yeah. Do you want to explain the episodic caveat?
Well, I'm not an expert on Stoicism, but I think the fact that we can arrive because of some circumstances at an emotional state, but then we choose what to do with that emotional state, is a really useful one in many circumstances. However, I've known Stoics who lose an essential part of their humanity by taking it to an extreme, Stoicism to an extreme. And I think that even physiologically, allowing an emotion to run its course rather than choosing to do something with the emotion, and I'm talking particularly about grief. Let's talk about grief. Allowing grief to run its course is very, very healthy. Yep. I mean, extremely healthy. And a perspective from some Stoics, not all of them, but some Stoics might be, yes, let it run, but then let's go beyond it. And grief is actually one of those processes, particularly for higher primates and for, we've seen in other animal communities. If you look at elephants, grief actually lasts a long time. And that's where we arrive at an unhealthy conclusion about what our behavior should be. And manipulating behavior in that way, I think, is a danger.
And I think that could happen with any type of field or study that you get too into without balance. If your whole world is, ethics, you might forget about some, basic human emotion or psychology, or, there's needs to be a balance and overlap, or else it seems like you just will isolate yourself from the rest of the world in this little pocket.
Right. Balance is the key. Absolutely. I would say good ethicists, however, have an understanding about that importance. And
yeah,
I've known some bad ones. Not many. So,
yeah.
So there was a question that I wanted to ask you when we sort of talk about the various levels of use of intuition for, like I was talking about before, with the sort of survival basic level and the problem solving level. We I think it's very clear from the outset that we've laid out a pretty big criticism of intuition with, the knowledge that something like musical intuition could be very useful. Are there cultural implications to correcting our erroneous perceptions about things? And is there utility in, say, letting people believe things that aren't true, that they sort of arrive to by intuition?
I think it certainly would depend on the specific examples that you're talking about, Chase. No, I don't think it's always bad to allow an individual to believe certain things. That certainly cannot ever be true. I would take the example of my mom. She just believes certain things because of her religious background that they're clearly untrue even in the physical world. It makes no sense to upset the woman by trying to retrain, a woman who's nearly 90 years old about,
right,
why her feeling about something is wrong.
Yeah.
She sometimes, by the way, comes around to the point. I'll give you a good example in, social sciences. So I've been with my partner, Peter. I've known him for 45 years. We've lived together 43 years. We're married. And it was very, very difficult for my mom because her intuition was, because of her background, that this was a very unhealthy relationship. Well, you stop talking about that after a while. And she absolutely adores Peter and loves him. So that wasn't really the issue. But several of my sibs have had rough times, and they've been married 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So my mom has finally sort of come around to say, from when Peter and I got married after 30 years together, saying this isn't a real marriage, to now people should just leave you alone. You're clearly in love. I mean, but to try to, take a sledgehammer to her at that point, was really quite useless. There are other things, however, where it's important, and I understand your question about cultural implications. When we have physicians who come to the United States to train, and perhaps in their culture, they're not allowed to treat women. They're not allowed to treat women. In order to practice in our society, then the retraining actually is extremely important. It has to be explicit, and it has to be clear. It has to be sensitive in the retraining. And if the physician cannot get beyond that, then the states are certainly not a place where they should be practicing medicine. And so the specific example, Chase, will make a huge difference.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in the examples where we do like want the sort of cultural value of correcting certain perceptions, what do you think is the best approach to have this value of, epistemological humility, or to put it another way, to this value of being open to changing your mind?
Yeah, I think the very, very first thing all of us need to do is set the stage with the fact that we are all fallible. The big mistake that I see in discourse today, and not just political discourse, is the j'accuse. I accuse you of something, rather than say, let's have a conversation. I've been getting some things wrong, and I need to step back and think about certain things and really do an analysis. Do you think that's a good plan that I'm doing this? And invariably you get a, yes, that's probably a good plan. And then once you set yourself up, if it's an important enough task to do this with another person, that, here's an example where I was completely wrong, and I brought some perhaps confirmational bias to it, and I had to really sit down and rethink it. I still don't feel great about it, but I had to retrain myself to really learn the truth. Have that conversation without then approaching the other person yet about the issue that you want to approach them. Just have the conversation without the back and forth. And then you approach it again some other time, because then it's already out there. It gives them a chance to digest and really think about it. And then you communicate with the person that, I've been thinking about this. Thank you for listening. And that's a really, really important thing. People often don't listen. And then that's the point where you can say, I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about, this area that you and I have discussed in the past. Would you be willing to do this experiment with me and relook at what we've been thinking, and is it some advice we brought with us? It doesn't always work, but it's a much, much better approach than say, you're a racist pig, you ought to change. That approach, unfortunately, the brain will shut down. They'll reinforce their confirmational bias with new data. So it's an approach that's very difficult in the moment. Particularly if you're out on the street and you see something horrible, of course, you don't always have the leisure of that approach. But when you do have the leisure, and it's an important person in your life, that's when you take the effort to do it. By the way, doing it with students over the years, it was really interesting. I had a student in class she fundamentalist Christian, really nice, wonderful person, really interesting, but really, really, really thought that it was not our job to, this person, by the way, went into the medical field, was not our job to save everyone, but primarily Americans, to help Americans medically. And so we had a long discussion about, because of course she believed in ensoulment and everyone has a soul. I asked her questions about, do these individuals have souls in their view? And we had long discussions about it. It was a very unsuccessful attempt to have some compassion develop on their part, but it was worthwhile.
So before we started recording, and I had brought up that I was going to read this quote from Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, where
Now you found the right one.
yeah, his whole premise is connecting, the sort of ought and is of things. Do you think there's a difference when cultivating this epistemological humility? Do you think there's a difference between when we're talking about something like a cultural value or versus something like the way the world works?
Well, it depends on the cultural value. So let's take, can we use a specific example as well?
Yeah, I think we've already got some good examples of cultural values, things like the sort of American souls need to be treated first in the medical field.
Yeah, it's hard in philosophy without using an example. So to give you a general response,
sure.
My view as an ethicist is there are moral truths that you can arrive at through the use of reason and compassion,
right,
that are the same amongst all cultures because of the human condition. And those, with compassionate conversation, those you never let go by the wayside. You just don't. And I still revert to a specific example, the case of female genital mutilation, female circumcision. It's simply a wrong for all the reasons that would make sense to any reasonable person. It's not just a religious bias. It creates great harm. It creates long-lasting harm, even unto death in some circumstances. And there is really no benefit at all to the person who should be the autonomous decider of what should be done, and that's the girl herself.
Yeah.
And so there are those examples, Chase, that you cannot let those slide. There are trivial examples that, of course, it's probably not worth the emotional and intellectual energy to pursue because, frankly, you would be doing it all day long, 24/7 for the rest of your life. But the important examples, it's still worth to say, there is a moral truth. Here's how I arrived at it. I'd like you to think about it. And then at some point, if you're not on the same page, then difficult decisions must be made.
My intuition is that some of those trivial examples may actually work as a sort of foot in the door to the overall attitude of humility.
That's a good point. It's an excellent point.
The example I can think of is you can ask someone, if you put a weight on a string and spin it around,
right,
and then at some point you cut the string with a laser or you let go,
sure,
what kind of path is the weight going to travel in?
Right.
And a lot of people's intuition will tell them, it'll continue in a sort of widening circle.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Right. So to me, and that's a fairly trivial, simple example.
It is. And it's one that you could demonstrate.
Right. And the nice thing about it, though, is because it doesn't have this moral weight behind it, you can sort of use it as, like I said, the foot in the door technique to say, well, your intuition may have been wrong about this, so it's worth examining what our intuitions tell us.
So then I misunderstood what you were asking earlier. I assumed they were all moral examples or ethical examples. So yes, you're absolutely right.
I meant all examples. Yeah, all examples in all domains.
No, I meant, okay. In terms of cultural bias.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Yes, no, exactly. That you can demonstrate. Here's the difficulty, segueing from this example in physics to an example in moral philosophy. And it's one that physics is a field of testable scientific fact. And therefore, there are scientific truths that are readily demonstratable in physics. In moral philosophies, the truths are truths of reason. Mm-hmm. So it's not going to take, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with it, and it's a really good starting point. It doesn't take reason, however, for the person who sees the experiment 7 times to realize, oh, you're right, it goes in a straight path it doesn't take reason. It's there right in front of them. Now, if you have a person or a population who is reticent about using reason, then you need an example of reason to begin with, an example that's the foot in the door. So you might segue from your physics example to a trivial moral philosophy example, if you can find such a one. A good one would be, stealing candy, for example. When is it a moral wrong for a child at a point? Because there's all of that ontological question as well. Then work from there. Then I think you're absolutely right.
Interesting.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these intuitions, it makes sense why people get defensive if you do the hammer approach, because our social interactions were important for our survival. So anything that feels like an attack on like our position or our group probably gets us defensive right away, and it brings up those intuitions.
Exactly. And it happens to all of us, no matter how we have experience in educational and significant analytical training background. I think that because we are experienced, perhaps, dealing with that, and then stepping back, physically, by the way, sometimes stepping back, then sometimes it's a little easier for us, but we still have the initial emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have to tell you, I still bristle and want to be physical when someone shouts faggot at me. Just, it's this sort of me. And then I step back and say, that's really interesting. You use that word. Where did you learn it? And, why do you feel comfortable using it? And it doesn't always work, but it works more often than not.
So if there was a takeaway that you could sort of implant in a listener's brain on what their attitude should be toward intuition, if they notice certain problems or certain things in life that they are using their intuition, what should that attitude be when they notice that intuition is how they're reaching a conclusion?
Well, I'd say the good news is intuition is almost always right.
Right.
So that's the good news. And you start out with that premise. But then, but with the recognition that at times it's wrong, and the more significant the problem is that you're working on, the more necessary it is, the more onus is on us to re-examine the conclusion or the idea that we have settled on, and then begin to use the analytical brain. That's extremely important. But intuition, I'm a big fan of intuition. I just think that for very, very significant problems in the world, it's cannot be the only step, the only neural process that we use. There has to be a conscious effort to engage the analytical mind as well.
It's worth double checking.
It's worth double checking and triple checking. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Measure twice, cut once.
I thought it was measure once, cut twice. I've been doing it wrong.
Exactly.
Okay. On this topic, are there any other points that you felt like we should cover?
I guess I would just say, kind of to lead by example, one of the things that I had a moral intuition about that I've changed was my attitude towards something like justice. Whereas I always felt like somebody should have to make up for what harm they've done to me or others, that they deserved, repercussions. And, the more I thought about it and, got more into Buddhist thinking and thought about that, it just seemed to me like unless it made a positive difference for the world, that was not the right intuition to have. That it doesn't seem moral to just want to inflict more suffering.
Retribution.
Unless it helps. Yeah, retribution.
I see. So that you're comparing really a Kantian perspective to an Eastern philosophical perspective. Kant would have said exactly what your original intuition said, although he came to actually by reason, by saying that the individual who committed this offense against you is actually, if they're an adult with competent mental facilities, they're a conscientious moral agent. They chose to do what they did to you, and consequently, in order for justice to be served, eye for an eye. That's essentially Kantian. I'm sort of in between. I'm certainly not a Kantian, so let's get that out of the way. I'm not necessarily completely with the Buddhist philosophy either. I think for the health of the individual at some point, it serves at least to have a recognition that a wrong was committed and a recognition of that. If they can use a rational mind and compassionate mind to come to that, then that's always useful. So, but in terms of justice, it's why the utilitarians are really against punishment, and the Kantians are punishment is absolutely necessary. And I'm much more utilitarian in that perspective.
Yeah, and I don't think there's, I think there's always probably a middle ground. Like if somebody's murdering people, there's no reason we shouldn't put them in prison, but I don't see any reason to then force them to suffer in prison.
Right. It diminishes us as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up as an example of something that I had a very strong intuition about or emotional reaction to, probably till I was in college. Maybe even a year or two into college. And I think that was just from everything I experienced growing up and, all the people around me and just not thinking about it.
Right. It makes perfect sense, Alex. And what I like about your very frank and honest revelation is that, in my view, it really supports the idea of moral progress, not only among communities, but within ourselves.
Yeah. All right. Mike, any last thoughts on intuition before we move on here?
No, although I did want to cover one other word, that is insight as opposed to intuition.
Sure.
So for those individuals who look at science as a way of thinking and a way of knowing and a way of doing, we actually use intuition. We have a feeling about how something is working, and we develop a hypothesis based on intuition often. And then there are times, by the way, that still has to be tested, so we still end up using analytical mind. But there are times where we have a cognitive process that we have not initiated, we didn't really start, we didn't do step by step, and we all of a sudden a light bulb turns on, and we've collected somehow information maybe within the same discipline or from other disciplines, and have that eureka moment. Oh my goodness, why didn't I see this connection before? And the connections are made. That's different because it's automatic, whereas it's a very, very fast phenomenon when it actually happens. It still builds on past experiences and probably builds on our intuition as well. So insight, I think, is really quite a useful. By the way, in terms of memory, things that we discover through insight, they stay in long-term memory very long periods of time. It's just that emotional component that you'll never forget that. Whereas I can remember some experiments I did that were not that really interesting, and I can't remember the data, but I'll always remember the data from chick experiment with a calcium burst into the blood.
All right. Yeah, I love that insight into insight. That's pretty good. So now we're going to go ahead and move on to a segment that we like to call the off topic. It can be, I believe Alex briefed you on this, hopefully, because this would be, a heck of an ambush if he didn't.
He did.
Okay. All right. So it can be, anything. It could be an idea that's influenced you. It could be something someone said to you in line at the grocery store. It could be a charity that you'd like to promote. So Mike, what do you have for us?
Well, I'd actually like to talk about the importance of humor in social discourse and in relationships.
All right.
I have been really quite fortunate to know individuals who have wicked senses of humor, including my partner, Peter. He's just probably one of the most wicked individuals I know. It's probably why we're still together. And he just makes me laugh every moment of the day, practically. So my youngest brother, Stephen, so he's the youngest of 11. He died of AIDS quite some years ago. And of course, it was traumatic for my mom, traumatic for the family. And of course, I was, as we all were, depressed about it. Some months later, I said to Peter, what would you do, if I had, some illness and, I would feel I'd be a burden on you. And he just looked up at me. He always looks up over his glasses and he said, it's quite clear. I would take 2 pillows and I would smother you. He just says the most outrageous things to make you laugh. And last night at rehearsal for Burnt Hills Oratorio Society, we're doing a wonderful piece called The Tree of Life. And our conductor is really wonderful conductor, Dr. William John Gray. And at one point, full orchestra was in, and he had stopped conducting, and the tenors and half of the men kept singing and kept singing and kept singing. And Bill, when they finally stopped, he said, well, that was really revelatory. He said, it means you really don't watch when I'm conducting, and it's really important. And let me tell you about a very famous incident of this. There was a conductor, and it might have been Schumann was conducting a pit. And they were doing an opera, he's conducting. There's a very, very close, he's down to his music very closely, but his baton was aimed backwards rather than forward. And he made a backward motion and stabbed himself in his scalp, and it slipped under the scalp, and then blood just started gushing out. And he, of course, had to leave. So he left, and the musicians kept playing. Several of them said, we didn't know you left. But I think if we have individuals in our lives who can approach us with humor, and by the way, use humor in whatever you do. This is what's one of the greatest things about our American culture and Western culture in general. We have such great comedians that help us diffuse the horrible gamut of emotions and therefore physiological toxins that we expose ourselves to. So I have a goal that nearly every day I have to find something that makes me laugh, and it makes life worth living, because you need it in a world as complex and as scary as the one we live in. This is where the survival of ourselves as individuals and as a species is really important. So that's my comment today.
Yeah.
Get some humor in your lives.
That's wonderful. It made me think of a John Cleese interview. You know John Cleese from
I love John Cleese.
Monty Python. Monty Python, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
He had an interview where he explained the difference between solemn and serious, and he makes this beautiful distinction where, like people, a business meeting is serious, a funeral is solemn, something like that. But this distinction was important because it allowed you to take serious situations and put humor in there, and that was such an important part of, being human in those situations. It's a wonderful clip. I don't know how long it is. It's worth looking up.
I definitely will. I'll tell you one other, and you probably will hit this one out because it's pretty ready. So my dad was he was ill with alcoholism. So he's a total alcoholic, and he beat us. He was a very abusive father. And my oldest sister in particular had a very difficult time with him. So when dad finally died, we were all at his funeral, and we were actually a little disappointed because towards the end of his life, he actually apologized to all of us because we wanted to beat on his coffin with a belt. It was just what he used to do to us. But my cousin, Father Randall Patterson, was trying to eulogize my father, and he didn't really know what to say because my mother, the nun, is in the audience. And the other people, and his ex-wife is in the audience. And so Randall's trying to figure out what to say to us. And he says, well, your dad's, wasn't always, a good father. And he did have problems with alcoholism, but, he's made his peace and he's now with the Lord. And he's with Jesus Christ in heaven. And you should take comfort in knowing that you're going to meet your father again in heaven. And my sister Gail said in the middle of church, fuck. And the whole church for a moment was silent, and then all of the siblings roared with laughter. So out of adversity, my sister made something that was, emotional. I was still emotional that my dad died, of course, but it's a story we tell all the time.
Yeah. We will not edit that out. That's going in there.
My mom was not
it's
pleased.
Been spoken, it's got to be heard. Yeah. Alex?
No, I agree. I think if we try to, we can make anything serious. And to deal with serious stuff is to then force other people to deal with you treating stuff seriously. So your relationships with them would seem to suffer if everybody around you knows you as the guy who like can't see things in a different way. You know, it's almost a lack of creativity too. You know, I think there's a definite connection between humor and creativity. So
That's an excellent point.
yeah. So I think it's just like you said, it's a healthier mindset to have. I one of the things I tend to do is get too involved in specific stuff. Like if I'm working on something, I'll just focus on that 100%. And I think in our country, that's smiled upon, you know, losing yourself in your work, you know, grinding, just going crazy, you know, to fulfill your destiny as a, you know, somebody who works to make money. But the more I think about it, the more I try to, like what you said, find humor and, you know, joy and beauty in each day, because if I don't have that, then, or if I don't have that, then who am I doing that for? And if I don't want somebody else to live like that, why would I do it to myself? So
Exactly. Right.
it's, and I can't do the hard work for as long as I could if I don't enjoy life or see a purpose in it. So yeah,
Right.
that's just my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. Beautiful. All right. Well, Mike, it's been wonderful having you on. It was great discussion. If people are interested in looking for any of your work or keeping up with some things you're doing, do you have a public presence, like a website or anything? Or
I don't. I really, I do still publish occasionally, but it's mostly in academic circles. I have a strong Facebook presence. That's about it, and
okay,
so I limit it that way. And of course, my performance background is such that I see a lot of people out in any case in the audience. So there are friends who know me in my science and ethics cap, and there are friends who know me in my music and dance cap. So
all right. Well, Mike, thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
my pleasure, and it was a delight to talk with you both. Best wishes with your endeavors together, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.